Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce, Ukraine War News Update, first part thereof for the 31st of August 2024. I'm very sorry this is late. It is that time of year where the summer has ended pretty much. School term's about to start. My twin boys, one of them does football on a Saturday and rugby on a Sunday. That's kicking off again. He had a football match this morning that I had to go to. Got man of the match. Scored an insanely good goal. Also achieved a penalty. And did the most amazing assist I've ever seen for a child of that age. And got, man of the match. It was an absolutely fantastic result. Pre-season friendly before the league starts next week. So Saturday and Sunday mornings, that's what I'll be doing going forward. My videos will, depends on the timing of the matches, will be generally later on the weekend or potentially a little bit earlier, as again due to the match timing. So sorry about that. Real life has its drawbacks, such as the output scheduling for my videos. Okay, let's look at the Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. Some interesting stats here. Predominantly, the first one, personnel 1,360. That's a very high number there. Something must have happened yesterday to get that ticking over, well over 1,300, which has been pretty much the upper end of the range that we've seen for the last few months. Sort of between 1,000 and 1,300 has been the regular number. When it gets to above 1,300 in this kind of way, then you're thinking something has happened fairly substantially yesterday. 8 tanks is on the daily average. 14 troop carrying AFVs is just below the daily average. 42 artillery systems is over double the daily average. So bit of hit and miss in terms of where these stats are going, in line with what our daily averages are. So 1 multiple launch rocket system, 62 vehicles and fuel tanks is obviously a pretty substantial number there, and 10 pieces of special equipment. So make of that what you will. We have been building up this picture that they're pretty accurate, these figures, even if they are not accurate, they are consistently inaccurate, as in the trends are definitely accurate. Okay, so now let's look at Andrew Perpetua's loss stats. And as you can see, more Ukrainian losses than Russian losses, but actually if you took the surveillance and comms equipment out, so some Starlinks in there, that for the intents and purposes of what we do, mainly looking at combat equipment losses, that then brings it down to about a 1-to-1. Remembering the black ones at the bottom are the actual civilians that the Russians have targeted. So, yeah. A lot of civilian vehicles. And actually, we've seen that recently. The Ukrainians starting to lose a lot more of the SUV and truck type vehicles, a lot more than they previously have. Double the amount of Russian losses in terms of civilian vehicles. And when you look at the combat losses, combat asset losses, the Ukrainians are actually losing half of what the Russians lost yesterday. So we need to drill down into these figures, as we always do, to get a proper understanding of what's going on. It could be that the Ukrainians are using more of these types of vehicles with a lack of combat assets, as we claim with the Russians. I doubt it. The Ukrainians really only attacking in the Kursk region, and as that becomes more positional, they're probably unlikely to lose as many vehicles, combat asset vehicles, whereas the Russians are attacking. Now, they took, apparently, Andrew Perpetua says he saw 30 vehicles taken out yesterday, 30 taken out the day before in the Pokrovsk and southern region, so Pokrovsk right down to Vuhledar, really. There have been a host of different attacks resulting in a lot of Russian losses. So that's worth taking into account. Okay, start with the Ukrainian losses. A lot of comms equipment that you can, if you want, kind of dismiss in terms of the sorts of stuff that we're looking at. 1 boat damaged, some artillery pieces damaged, some tanks damaged and destroyed, about 50-50 on the tanks. Not about, it is exactly 50-50. Both IFVs lost, 1 abandoned, 1 destroyed, but old BMPs, so that's not too much of a worry. And APCs and M113 damaged and BTR-70 damaged, so a much older vehicle there. Okay, nothing too bad for the Ukrainians. A lot of, as mentioned, a lot of civilian vehicles, pickup trucks being destroyed there. A lot of them taken out by FPV drones, of course. And when I say a lot of them, all of them. All of the civilian vehicles taken out by FPV drones. 2 ATVs captured. I don't know what the story is behind that, but a couple of quads captured. Right, moving on to the Russian losses. Nothing too valuable at the top of the list, such as air defense systems, etc., or radars. A few pieces of artillery, actually 3 out of 4 of the artillery pieces destroyed. For the tanks, quite a number of tanks there, or almost 10. And we have, what, 6 out of 9 were captured, abandoned, or destroyed. We've got a T-80 BVM Mod 2022 that has been captured. And in fact, quite a large number of tanks have been captured, as far as I can work out, in the Kursk direction. Reporting from Ukraine has a video broadly on that this morning, talking about T-90, a recent T-90 capture there. Track Garden Shed, another T-72, both abandoned, 3 destroyed, and then the T-90M damaged there by an unknown cause. So quite a few tanks on the list, and quite a few IFBs on the list again. Half of them BMPs, half of them BTR 82 ATs there. Those latter ones all damaged, the former mainly destroyed or abandoned. And then with the APCs, 100% of those destroyed, 4 of those out of 4 taken out of the game. So a fairly substantial proportion of the civilian vehicles destroyed as opposed to damaged, but not as many civilian vehicles as Ukrainian civilian vehicles, and some unknown vehicles that are just unable to be identified. Obviously some kind of husk of these vehicles left, or the resolution of imagery but too poor to be able to ascertain exactly what they are. So what does this tell us? That the Russians are probably attacking more than the Ukrainians. The Russians are losing a lot of combat assets. The Ukrainians losing more civilian vehicles at the moment, and that might tell you a story somehow. Now, with regard to personnel losses, as ever, the Mediadzona and BBC Russia analysis of Russian social media posts and whatnot, declarations of funerals, obituaries, the absolute 100% kind of evidence, or as good as you can get, of someone dying, and that being connected to the war. So if there's a funeral or an obituary or whatever, and it doesn't mention that that person died in the war, then they don't include it, even if they got a pretty good idea that they did die in the war. It's quite a high benchmark for qualifying for these statistics. And this is your absolute, rock bottom number of your absolute minimum number of people in Russia who have died in the war. And that doesn't include LPR and DPR as well. So the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic forces that are fighting, as Russians often are, Russians, but often are people from within those regions as well. Now, if you were to add those, and then obviously this would be far greater, but actually this is, as mentioned, a real minimum. The reality is it's going to be far, far higher than this. And 66,000 is the latest number they've given, which is substantial, and gives you an indication that this war is taking a huge toll on the Russians. As it described in the Kyiv Independent later, more than 66,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in Ukraine amid the full-scale war, according to a report by independent Russian media outlet Mediadzona, and along with BBC News Russia. They've been documenting the names of soldiers killed in Ukraine through open source research. The report stated that at least 12,813 prisoners recruited from prisons, 12,566 volunteers, and 8,610 mobilized troops have died while serving in the Russian forces during the war. What else? There was something at the bottom here that was pretty interesting. Yeah, here. In July 2024, Meduza and Mediadzona, so one of the same organizations, and Meduza, another exiled Russian organization, estimated that at least 120,000 Russian soldiers had died in the invasion, based on probate and inheritance records. So 66,000, this is the same organization, or one of the same organizations, saying, right, we know 66,000 Russians have died because here are their obituaries, and here are their names, and here are their pictures, and here are their families mourning over their deaths. So we know 66,000 have definitely died. The real number is going to be far higher. We don't know what that is. But then looking with Meduza at the probate and inheritance records, we're estimating it's probably 120,000 people who have died. Ukraine's general staff has estimated Russian military personnel losses have surpassed 500,000, but that does include killed, of course, wounded, missing and captured. So the Kiev Independent confirming what we've already discussed many a time, which is these numbers are now definitely thought to include all military casualties, and casualties in war, as mentioned, are killed, wounded, POWs and deserted. So anyway, there you go. And missing is a key one for the Russians, because it's not so much deserted as left out on the battlefield. In February, President Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, said 180,000 Russian troops have been killed since the start of the war. The president said over 31,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed over the same time. And of course, that was thought to be very much a lower end of the estimate there for the Ukrainians. So that's a bit of, I would say, strategic disinformation from Zelensky there, for obvious reasons, keep the morale going and whatnot. So I think the Russians have taken some really heavy casualties. Exactly what the number is, we won't know for many years, I'm sure. Right, 2024 Kharkiv offensive. So this is the one from Belgorod down into Kharkiv. Has confirmed equipment losses as follows, and this is Nalcio that's done. Right, what's interesting is if you look at these different areas, the ratios are very different. So the Pokrovsk direction, so attacking into Avdiivka and then beyond, the Russians have lost something like 1,300 bits of kit at a ratio of around 5 to 1. So they're losing 5 to every 1 Ukrainian loss, the Russians, combat asset losses. In the Kharkiv direction, as you can see here, the Russians have lost, they've had another 24, the Ukrainians 13, so that's 165 to 83. So that's almost exactly 2 to 1, right? So we've gone from 5 to 1 down there, 2 to 1 up in Kharkiv. That was actually partially because at the beginning, the Ukrainians rushed up a bunch of equipment and the Russians hit that with medium range, so Lancets particularly. So the Ukrainians lost quite a lot of Bogdanas, these self-propelled guns and other pieces of artillery. And then they kind of got the ratio back in order a little bit. So it's at a 2 to 1 ratio there of Russian to Ukrainian losses. And then when we go to the Kursk offensive, where the Ukrainians are attacking to Russia, the Ukrainians are losing more than the Russians, but it's only about 1.5 to 1. So these are all visually confirmed. This is your open source intelligence. This isn't kind of biased or anything, but it does just paint a very interesting picture of what's going on. Russians losing tremendous amounts in Pokrovsk. Russians doing slightly better in Kharkiv, given it was a surprise attack, where the other ones in the Pokrovsk region wasn't so much a surprise attack. They were just throwing loads in the Avdiivka area at the beginning. And then Kursk was a surprise attack that the Ukrainians managed to prosecute. And they've, being on the attack, you're going to lose more than the defense. You literally have more equipment than the defense. You don't use infantry fighting vehicles to defend trench lines. You use trenches and people and buildings and people, occasionally tanks and artillery and so on and so forth. But you will have fewer pieces of kit. And so what's interesting here is that the Ukrainians on the attack have done a better job of mitigating against losses than the Russians, which we can guess, because the Russians don't really care so much. Their metrics of success are territory, and they don't value human life, and it doesn't appear that they value equipment all that much. They just throw it in. So the kind of better Russian attack looks like a 2 to 1 loss ratio. The worst one looks like a 5 to 1 loss ratio, and the Ukrainian attack is a 1.5 to 1 loss ratio. So they're doing better there. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that one in there. Okay. So no reports here talking about capture of tanks. So this is what I mentioned a little bit earlier. Ukrainian paratroopers in the Kursk region have captured 7 Russian tanks, including 1 T-90M, 4 T-80 BVMs and 2 T-72s. Some of these tanks are nearly new, having just come off the assembly line, while others require repairs. That's really interesting. Of course, that is a zero-sum game for the Ukrainians, where the Russians are losing a tank, and the Ukrainians are gaining that tank to be able to be used against the Russians. So capture is definitely the best form of outcome for these vehicles. Whereas, you know, if the Russians have a tank blown up, that's not a zero-sum game. That is, you've lost it. The Ukrainians don't necessarily gain it. Okay, 2 nights ago, a column of the Russian armed forces, with the help of HIMARS, was destroyed again. The losses are significant. The pontoon crossing was also destroyed in Zvanoye in the Kursk region. And indeed, in any case, said Anton Gerashenko, quoting here, in any case, there are casualties, but they keep quiet. We have everything under control, they say. Another column of the Russian army was destroyed in the Kursk region, as well as an attempt by the Russians to organize a crossing of the same river near a broken bridge near the village of Zvanoye. So I think they've put a pontoon across the broken bridge, as you can see from this video on the left there. According to videos published by eyewitnesses, Kursk region, the village of Zvanoye, an engineering construction and 2 groups of engineer equipment were destroyed, says the Belgorod People's Republic Telegram channel. So these are mainly engineering vehicles, and you can see someone walking past all these burnt out husks of vehicles that have clearly been taken out, or one assumes it's true that they have been taken out by HIMARS or guided multiple launch rockets. And here, if we look at this video, let's try and get that in slightly larger for you guys. So it's quite a bit of destroyed equipment there, but it's the bridge I wanted to show you in this one, to show you that more bits of kit here and there. But as you go to the bridge, you can see that this looks like a bridge that has already been blown up, and then they tried to create a pontoon bridge. So here's a bridge laying. Well, this is a bridge that has been bridge laid by an engineering vehicle, and then that has subsequently fallen through and been hit. Anyway, I thought that was worth showing you. Right, moving on. Yesterday morning, Tim White says, I was writing about a big explosion in Sumy. So that's a Ukrainian oblast. And I was concerned why there were no photos or details for many hours. Now Russia claims it hit a temporary deployment point of Ukrainian forces near Chernetchina. It says 35 soldiers would have died in this strike. Already the kind of phrasing of that leads you to think, well, hopefully that wasn't the case. You know, you need good evidence to suggest that, although, you know, we see this from both sides. At first, I thought smoke in the previous video didn't match initial ground photos released in Sumy. However, sad to say, there's a second video from Russia's MOD of a missile strike on an ammo warehouse in Sumy. So it might not have been a troop deployment, but an ammo warehouse, which does match yesterday's pictures. So both vids are probably true. So it could have been 2 strikes, not quite sure what the outcome is there, but evidently Russia having some successful strikes on Sumy, which is a pretty big shame there. Now, this is happening more and more. Ukrainian Wild Hornets drones are successfully shooting down, or intercepting, it's probably a better term, intercepting Russian reconnaissance drones. This video shows 12 drones being taken down. So you've got these medium-range reconnaissance drones, your Orlan 10s, Orlan 30s, Zalas, so on and so forth. And more frequently, we are seeing the Ukrainians take them down with basically kamikaze FPV drones, flying into them and bringing them down, so that they don't do the spotting for, you know, pretty horrendous missile strikes like we just saw in Sumy there. Okay, Chris Wiki has an interesting thread here, and I've been talking about this fairly explicitly, which is that we have seen over time civilian vehicles become more and more prevalent on the loss list. This is actually a day of low civilian vehicle losses. We have seen fewer and fewer trucks be lost over time compared to the beginning of the war, when they had obviously far more military trucks, the Kamazes and Urals and whatnot. That they have become less frequent because, in terms of being lost, because one assumes they just don't have them, and so they are being replaced. And APCs, I think, are being replaced by ATVs and other civilian vehicles, motorcycles, SUVs. These sort of vehicles are being used more and more by the Russians because they have to. It's kind of needs must. Well, Chris Owicki does a thread on this. A chronic shortage of military vehicles has left the Russian army in Ukraine dependent upon the civilian vehicles. This is leading to conflict, sometimes with weapons drawn, between Russian troops and military police who are trying to confiscate the vehicles. 2 years of constant artillery and drone attacks have destroyed much of Russia's fleet of military transport vehicles. In their place, volunteers and soldiers themselves have purchased or donated numerous civilian vehicles, which are used to transport ammo, supplies and men. As a result of constant attrition, according to Russian soldiers, a unit that would originally have had 5 trucks to transport its men now has to rely on around 50 passenger cars. At best, though, it likely only has 5 or 10, which constantly break down or are destroyed. Russian troops rely on civilian vehicles purchased by themselves or donated. However, the military police have been under orders since 2023 to confiscate unregistered vehicles. Until recently, this was not enforced because it would leave the troops without transportation. Now, however, new leadership in Russia's military police has ordered a crackdown and they are seizing unregistered vehicles, despite the consequences for the troops, who are furious about the decision and have even more reason than usual to detest the military police. Russia's military police are widely despised by the troops as cowardly parasites who harass ordinary soldiers in the rear areas. They are notoriously corrupt, demanding bribes for minor infractions. According to the Russian mill blogger interviewed by Sever.Reali, quote, military police have always been like that. They haven't seen a real war. They can't even compare in experience with the volunteers. They work where it's almost safe. In general, their job is to, for example, catch a drunk soldier before he manages to shoot someone and then give his commander a dressing down for allowing this to happen. They impose harsh punishments as well as imposing fines or demanding bribes. They imprison men in zindans, open-air pits, or make them hug birches, tie them to trees for days. Soldiers require combat orders known as burkas to go through military police checkpoints. Andrei, a Russian soldier serving in the occupied part of Ukraine's Zaporizhia region, comments that without one, quote, the bastards for whose sake we've gathered here won't let him pass the checkpoint. They'll give him a slap on the wrist and put him in a pit for 10 days. The crackdown on vehicles is happening without regard for military efficiency. According to the mill blogger, it was prompted by soldiers causing traffic accidents in unauthorized civilian vehicles. They are military, quote, they are military, but the cars are civilian. A soldier is on the payroll and the army has to be responsible, but the army has no idea about this vehicle. The military police sees these situations, but they don't see how the same vehicles carry ammunition. You don't see 5 boxes of ammunition in the front line of the lorry under drones. And so in their eyes, the military's personal vehicles are a detriment. And it's not customary for them to argue with orders, and to put a soldier in a zindan is a tick in the box, just like the cops do in the civilian world. Andrei, the soldier, points out that, quote, only stupid orders like this are accepted for implementation, but orders to provide the troops with everything they need are not. I understand it if there were a lot of military vehicles and we would use all kinds of old Ladas and Mercs to go for a ride with women, but no. He is angry that the military police pay more attention to Russian soldiers than to the disloyal Ukrainians in occupied cities such as Melitopol, where he says that, quote, normal filtration measures were not carried out there. They simply changed the flags and everyone continued to live as they live. It seems to me that this contradicts the basic concept of security. Andrei says that he experiences contempt and hatred from waiters, people awaiting liberation in Ukraine. Well, for example, I don't get cocky, I don't assert my rights and so on, but I still encounter contempt and hatred. Someone speaks the Ukrainian language on principle. This is a clear waiter, but what can I do to him? I won't drag him to the FSB for a sideways glance. And of course, you know, of course there are going to be people who think like that, right? Instead, he says the military police harass ordinary soldiers even to the point of endangering their lives. A month ago, they tried to confiscate the vehicles in which his unit's medical company transports wounded soldiers, known as 300s. As one of the company explains, we have 2 loaves, those are the Scooby-Doo vans, which we use to transport 300s. Volunteers from Arkhangelsk gave us these loaves. They just gave them to us. We didn't pay them anything. The staff cars died a long time ago. We still have them, but they have to be repaired after every trip, and it's not clear whether they will stop halfway through. New cars are reliable, and on staff cars we go to the city to buy medicines which we need to replenish quickly. And in July the military police showed up at our door. They said they had orders to take everything, and that was unaccounted for. We sent them away and they left. The military police returned soon afterwards with a senior officer and a vehicle armed with a machine gun and demanded the medical vehicles at gunpoint. The soldiers fobbed them off with the story that their commander was away on a mission and would need a written order. Quote, "We said we would give them everything, but please give us a written order and come back in the evening." They seemed to calm down, and we started thinking and came up with the idea of breaking the vehicles so that they wouldn't move and we could easily fix them later. In short, we just took out the spark plugs, replaced them with old ones, one by one anyway. These guys arrived, but by the way, without a written order. We said, okay, take them. They couldn't start the vehicles. The troops that say they are only using civilian vehicles because they lack any army-supplied alternatives. You understand, we wouldn't need civilian cars if we had our own, because a regular loaf is not equipped with anything. You can't support it officially. That is, we buy gasoline ourselves, we repair and assemble everything inside so that we can provide assistance ourselves. The issued staff cars are better equipped and more comfortable, but they have one drawback: they don't drive at all. Andre notes that the Russian army is not replacing its huge losses of vehicles, leaving soldiers stuck. Quote, "How many vehicles have we already had destroyed, combat ones I mean? For every 10 lost, they replenish us with one. Well, here we are, sitting without transport." The military police attempted to confiscate his own unit's vehicles, a UAZ and an old Mercedes and Lada purchased from local people. When the military turned up to confiscate them, one of Andre's soldiers turned an APC's machine gun on them. He said to them, "If you don't leave now, I will kill you. We don't even have to roll out the BTR. I'm going to sit in a turret, turn the cannon around and shoot at you." They were stunned, but I don't think they believed him, and he just turned around and went to open the BTR. The MPs jumped into the car and drove away. Our daredevil came back laughing, and I told him, "Woodpecker, machine gunner. They'll be back with reinforcements right away." In the end, the MPs didn't come back, but only filed a complaint against the troops. A Russian military expert notes the futility of the military police's crackdown. Quote, "As for these cars, almost all the passenger cars that are currently in the hands of the Russian military were bought by them with their own money and handed over by volunteers. If they're all taken away, the first question, of course, is where to put them, and secondly, let them be ready to hear a report on the failure to complete a combat mission. Previously, they used a passenger car for reconnaissance, but now there is no reconnaissance. Well, of course, in general, such an approach does not really help to raise morale. You do not give us anything, we buy it ourselves, so you take it away." Okay, there's a long thread there, but I think it's really important because it goes a long way to explain the losses that we see and the pattern of the types of vehicles that we do see lost. And it's just this incredible situation where the Russians... You can imagine this in peacetime. Like, if you've got Russian soldiers driving around in peacetime in unregistered cars, knocking people over. And by the way, we have seen vehicles crash into civilians. I've seen some pretty horrific video footage of Russian vehicles just driving through red lights or driving along the road and just knocking people over and killing people. So this does happen fairly frequently, or not infrequently. And you know, in peacetime, you'd be like, right, this has to stop. We can't have the military driving around, knocking people over and driving in unregistered cars that aren't insured, etc., etc., etc. But this is in the middle of the war zone, and it's kind of weird to try and enforce these rules as you're driving around in cars trying to get medical supplies to your unit. So yeah, it's just bizarre, but it's kind of Soviet bureaucracy taken to a ridiculous level. Now, a helicopter with 22 people on board is feared to have crashed in Russia in the far eastern state of Kamchatka. If you know your Risk board, you know where that is. The Mi-8 tourist flight, similar to the one in the photo with 3 crew, disappeared near the Vachkazhets volcano. Not related to the military at all, but is it related to aviation, maintenance? It's another lost helicopter. These do happen fairly often inside Russia. Okay, Russia on fire, and this seems to be a bit of a growing problem, this one. So started off being reported like this. In central Moscow, they say a big fire in a 3-story building is burning in Berezhkovskaya embankment. However, there's virtually no glimpse of the building itself in this video released by Russia's emergency services, which says it's deployed 110 firemen. Well, actually, there's more footage coming out, often from a distance. This is quite a big fire. Fire broke out in the center of Moscow. A 3-story administrative building has been burning for several hours. The fire is reportedly thousands of square meters. Helicopters, drones, and firefighting ship Colonel Chernyshev were involved in the extinguishment. According to preliminary data, there are no casualties. But yeah, pretty significant fire there in the middle of Russia. There is no quick way to put fires out in Russia, says Anton Gerashchenko. Even in Moscow, all the money and equipment are being used to kill Ukrainians. I mean, there is this idea that firefighters, certainly out in wildfire sort of areas, have been drafted into the that work is done often by conscripts, and the conscripts themselves are just fighting and defending the borders of Russia, and so there is a distinct inability for the Russians to put out fires. And another big fire, I don't know if it's got anything to do with sabotage or anything in particular, or whether it's just a random Russian smoker, but certainly something to keep an eye on in Moscow there. Now, overnight, a number of drones again were fired. The Russians are keeping a fairly consistently high number of drones being sent into Ukraine, and this does tell you that their production of these is fairly decent. Although it's interesting that report here that one of these drones, a rocket-powered drone of unspecified type, was recently shot down. The drone likely served as a decoy. It lacked a warhead and any optics or reconnaissance equipment. It was downed during the latest large-scale missile attack. So this could be a case of sending over, if they can make that relatively cheaply, just send it over. You don't even need to target it anywhere. Send a load of rocket drones over in order that the Ukrainians take them out with expensive missiles, and it just, you're trying to eke out that asymmetry, so the Ukrainians are unable to sustain these consistent attacks because they're using, say, Patriot and Nazan's missiles that is exceedingly expensive to shoot those those kind of nothing drones down, because you don't know what they are as they're flying through the air. They shoot them down, and then that's cost $1 million in terms of a missile, and they just can't keep on doing that. Anyway, last night 52 Shahed drones were fired into Ukraine. One went off to Belarus, 2 more returned to Russia. 25 of them fell harmlessly on their own, while air defense shot down 24. So the interception rate seems only about 50%, which is exceptionally low, but it appears that 100% of them were taken out. So we're now getting to a stage where electronic warfare on these Shahed drones is becoming more and more effective. So here we have, at least according to the Ukrainian General Staff, so pinch of salt and all that, but 52 sent in, 24, so less than 50% were intercepted, shot down. 25 of them fell on their own, so that is 49. And then the other 3, 1 went to Belarus and 2 went to Russia. So that's 100% success rate for these not reaching their targets. And that's really good news. On the other hand, 1 Iskander-M ballistic missile and 4 S-300 surface-to-air missiles were not stopped. I don't know what damage they did and where those missiles were aimed, but yeah, so remember, every night you get missiles that do get through, and indeed drones that get through, they are adding to that already wide-scale destruction that's taken place over the course of this war, and they're just chipping away and chipping away. So don't ignore these ones that get through and that we don't hear anything about. That, for example, they could have taken out a factory that makes tanks, right? And now Ukraine is unable to make tanks. That hasn't happened, or it may not. I don't know. I'm completely making that up. But, you know, be cognizant that there could be some serious damage done by those missiles. Now, biggest news, I almost did a breaking news piece on this yesterday. It was huge. A residential building was attacked by occupiers in Kharkiv, and it's partially collapsed. It was pretty terrible. There's lots of footage of this. A lot of dead. In fact, there's supposed to be, well, some say 6, some say 7 now killed, and a huge number of people wounded. Here the claim is mass attack in Kharkiv, wounded 97 people, 22 of those injured were kids. The death toll has stayed at 7, a reminder that Russia dropped 5 aerial bombs on the city, hitting civilian infrastructure and civilians themselves. Just seemingly flinging guided glide bombs into a city. This is disgusting, right? And there is not a lot said about this. Okay, in the international community because it's become so normalized. But this was a horrific strike yesterday. Cars were on fire in Kharkiv near the 12-story building following an airstrike. Russian targeted 5 locations in Kharkiv, and the efforts to address the aftermath are ongoing, according to the mayor. He confirmed that a 14-year-old girl was killed in the strike and reported that 40 people have been hospitalized. And just to give you an idea of the human cost of this, here is the 18-year-old artist, Veronica Kushushko. She was an artist. She lived in Kharkiv. Yesterday, she was killed as Russia was bombing the city again. She was just 18, and you can add her name to all the other people who were killed, young and old alike, yesterday and on other days. And it's just one human disaster after another. Mourning has been announced in Kharkiv today, the mayor of the city reports. As a result of yesterday's Russian shelling, 6 people were killed, or 7, depending on who you listen to. Another 80 were wounded, or 97. Among the injured were 22 children, including a 10-month-old baby. There you go. And Zelensky reacted to that, said the Russian strike on Kharkiv directly on people, on ordinary houses. All services are completely engaged in the rescue operation. I thank everyone who is helping to save lives at this moment. So this was yesterday. This strike was carried out using a Russian-guided aerial bomb, a strike that could have been prevented if our defense forces had the capability to destroy Russian military aircraft at their bases. We need strong decisions from our partners to stop this terror. Absolutely right. This is a sort of thing that should lead the US to go, oh, do you know what? You can hit those air bases because we need to stop this from happening. You can't shoot down guided glide bombs out the sky. They're not the sort of things you intercept. And so therefore, you either shoot down the airplanes as they're in the sky. So you need really good air defenses and you need to put them right near the border. Or more realistically, you need to be able to shoot at those air bases with missiles. And the US, unfortunately, is not allowing that to happen. Zelensky continues, this is an absolutely legitimate need. There's no rational reason to limit Ukraine's defense. We need long-range capabilities and full implementation of air defense agreements for Ukraine. These are life-saving measures. Exactly. Now, on the other hand, that was terrible. I don't quite understand what happened here. So Belgorod, there were literally 2 missiles hit in Belgorod on a highway. Now, the Russians are claiming that the Ukrainians have struck, rather similarly in Belgorod. The roof of a shopping centre in Belgorod, in Russia, burns down after malfunction of local air defence systems. There are victims, local media reports. Now, some are saying that this was misfiring from local air defences. Russians are obviously not saying that. And they are claiming that the Ukrainians have struck Belgorod. But as I always say, Ukrainians are pretty much never going to strike at non-military or military-connected targets on purpose. They don't have enough missiles to bother doing that. They're desperate to hit military targets, and if they do that on purpose, it will absolutely turn off support for Ukraine, and that's what they need the most, right? They are surviving at the moment because there is a unity amongst allies supporting the good guys in the war against the bad guys. If the Ukrainians start acting like bad guys, they will lose that support. So it's not in their best interest. It is just, they are never going to do that. So if Ukrainian missiles do hit, it's going to be due to, my supposition is going to be due to Russian electronic warfare, Russian interceptors sending them off course, or the Russian interceptors themselves, as we have seen in Belgorod. So we have seen something like, I've shown you now imagery and video of at least 3 Pantsir S-1 air defense missiles that have landed in Belgorod, as in the Russian air defense missiles. We've seen them embedded in buildings. They have form for throwing their own air defense systems, air defense interceptors into Belgorod. So could this be Russian air defense missiles? Yes, it could. Probability, your top probability is maybe electronic warfare number 1, sending Ukrainian missiles off course, or Russian missiles. It's not going to be purposefully targeting the side of a highway, right? The Ukrainians are not going to be trying to do that. Okay. Day 4 of a blaze at Russia's Atlas oil depot in Kamyansky district in Rostov. So it's still burning. Initially, 2 fuel tanks caught fire from a Ukrainian drone attack. Later, more tanks exploded. Currently, Russian firefighting efforts appear to be ineffective. It says not too ineffective. It means ineffective. So Eurominded Press reporting there. So that's still on fire. I presume they finally put out the other one in Proletask that had been burning for something like 14 days. Haven't heard any more on that one. Right now, let's go to other bits and pieces. Let's quickly sift through this. So, quote, in a Pokrovsk direction, the reserves of the enemy infantry exceeded the reserves in the Bakhmut direction during active offensive operations in the winter of 2023. As you can see, the Russians have no limits. The biggest mistake was to bet on the destruction of as many Russian infantry as possible and to neglect the development of defensive fortifications. That's Ukrainian serviceman Osman from the 24th IDAR Battalion. He's been in Bakhmut, he's been up in Kharkiv, and he clearly down in the Pokrovsk area at the moment, or possibly. He's saying that haven't built enough fortifications, and the Russians are just throwing huge numbers of reserves into the area, even more than Bakhmut. They smell kind of victory in that area, don't they, the Russians? Now, Dmitry from War Translators says Ukrainian National Guard has deployed its offensive Kara-Dag brigade to Pokrovsk. They number 2,000 fighters, according to David Axe at Forbes. Although it hasn't stopped the advance, Russians are still wondering where the remaining Ukrainian reserve brigades are. Could it be that they're not fully trained yet? Could it be that they're not fully equipped yet? Are they waiting for another offensive? Are they waiting for the Russians to get to a certain point to do some kind of nifty counterattack to cut them off? Don't think. Many of those, some of those are not likely scenarios. But anyway, they are committing some forces to that area. The question is, why didn't they do that a week or two ago if those forces were available? What's the agenda? What's going on? Now, again, Dmitry says Russian war correspondent Romanov, discussing the situation in the Kursk region, believes that the Ukrainian armed forces are unlikely to be expelled from this area before the war ends. So that's into the Russian territory that the Ukrainians have taken that land, and they are unlikely to be shifted before the end of the war. He highlights a significant presence of Ukrainian FPV drones, noting that their numbers surpass those in Robotyne and are comparable to the levels seen in Vovchansk. Romanov also points out that the contact line in the region is highly unstable, making it easy to encounter friendly fire when moving along it. Interesting. And we have seen the Russians commit some friendly fire incidents there. Finally, he adds that the Ukrainians are using Wagner tactics of finding weak points in Russian defences and navigating larger Ukrainian forces to them. So that is that deep battle doctrine of attacking everywhere, seeing where there's a weak point, and then overloading that weak point. Okay. The commander of this is National Air Force Day, and over the last 24 hours, Mykola Oleschuk has been dismissed as the commander of the Ukrainian Air Force, dismissed by Zelensky. Now, this happens during war. It's not unusual, especially when you're 2.5 years into the war. You are going to get people moved aside. Zaluzhny replaced by Sursky. So don't think too much of this, but also think, or has what's happened here? So it could be that this is part of the course. You need changeover, you need fresh ideas, someone else to take over for a bit, or this guy's cocked up, blah blah blah, or he's had an argument, he's not one of Zelensky's kind of in group, or whatever it is. Something's happened here. So that's followed Monday's crash. There wasn't anything to do with the F-16 that went down and the death of one of the pilots who had completed training on the aircraft. But anyway, and Anatoly Krivnozhko will take over, acting commander of the Ukrainian Air Force, until another officer is appointed to the position. So we might hear that name, and I'll butcher it as equally well the next time I say it. We might hear that name in the future. Okay. So Igor Shushko saying, update, Putin didn't just arrest former Deputy Defense Minister General Popov. I reported that the other day. He had already been moved aside previously, and now he's been arrested. His wife, 2 adult children, his secretary Ekaterina, and his deputy Major General Mikhail Mironov, and his assistant Andrei Voroshilo were also raided and taken away at the same time and are now missing. So that's really substantial news there, as we've seen this kind of gradual purge of the Russian military hierarchy. A man from Mariupol shared what his life is like now. Russians came, bombed people's homes, and now they humiliate the residents, make demands, and dictate how they should live. Mariupol residents were home. Now they're guests in the Russian world that has occupied their homes. This is what freedom looks like. This is what liberation looks like in Russia. And it's not cool. I won't read you through that one. But anyway, there are people who are not happy with the way Russians are are scapegoats liberating the regions in Ukraine. Now, Max24 says Ukraine has severed the secret telephone connection between Kyiv and Moscow, which has existed since 1998, says the Cabinet of Ministers representative in the Verkhovna Rada, Melnichuk. So that phone line is now no longer active. And then we have a report from the Omsk region declaring it's a state of emergency due to heavy rainfall, harvesting. And I think, is this the largest area of harvesting in Russia? I'm not sure, but anyway, harvesting campaign postponed to a later date. So we've heard that actually the Russians are going to be in a spot of bother with regard to harvesting this year. The weather's not been kind to them. We've had a lot of flooding, and of course that means a lack of money, which also then means a lack of ability to prosecute the war in the fashion that they are doing at the moment. As Trentelenko says, this sounds like Russia lacks the fuel and labour to run the harvest combines as well. So when you've had fuel depots so fundamentally hit and the refineries hit, and you've got a labour shortage, things could be, add towards a perfect storm in terms of harvesting crops. And then this one, just I'll show you this. It says, God saves our souls, Patriot saves our lives. So this is at the site of the, it was at the epicenter, in Kharkiv, that builder's merchant, that DIY superstore that was blown up by the Russians. Completely, destroyed, and now they've written this as a geoglyph on the what looks like on the car park. God saves our souls, Patriot saves our lives. In other words, we need patriots. Thoughts and prayers ain't going to do quite enough in terms of defending Ukrainian territory. Anyway, that's enough from me. A long one, as ever. Take care, guys. Speak soon. Toodle pips.